The storm was closing in. The man was alone, until something massive moved in the snow. A bear. A mother. And what she was carrying in her jaws would turn his entire world upside down. Welcome to Mr. Whisker's Stories. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, please hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you powerful, true-to-life stories from the wild. The winter that year came early, with a vengeance. By mid-November, the mountain forests of northern Washington were already wrapped in layers of ice and silence. Snow buried everything: the roads, the trails, the past. Elliot Granger, a man in his early 50s, had retreated to this secluded log cabin 6 years ago after the sudden death of his wife and daughter in a car accident. The pain had driven him from the city and into the arms of nature's indifference, where he thought he could live without needing or being needed. He had grown used to the quiet, the kind of quiet that crept into your bones and made you forget the world had ever been loud. His days were marked by rituals: firewood chopping in the morning, tinkering with his ham radio in the afternoon, and feeding the birds and squirrels at dusk. But this winter was colder than most. It bit into the wood, creaked in the cabin's beams, and whispered unsettlingly through the trees at night. Elliot had stocked enough canned food, coffee, and firewood to last until spring, and he didn't expect company, especially not in the form of a knock at the door. Not a human knock, but a heavy, deliberate thud followed by a slow dragging sound. It came late in the evening, just as he was pouring hot water over a tea bag, the scent of chamomile barely managing to soothe his always-on-edge nerves. At first, he thought it was the wind or maybe a tree limb falling. But when he heard the thud again, closer, more persistent, he froze. Then came the sound that changed everything: a low, guttural moan. Not angry or threatening, more like a plea. He hesitated. Every instinct in his body told him not to open that door. He wasn't afraid of people, but he was wary of what nature could bring unannounced. Wild animals occasionally came near the cabin, especially in rough winters, but this felt different, intentional, focused. Heart racing, he slowly approached the door, grabbing his old hunting flashlight and switching it on. The beam illuminated the frosted wood of the front door and the worn handle he rarely used. His hand trembled as he reached for it, hesitating one final moment before pulling it open just a crack. The cold rushed in like a scream. And there she was. A full-grown grizzly, gaunt and battered, stood barely 2 feet away on the snow-covered porch. Her fur was matted with frost, and steam billowed from her nostrils with each labored breath. She looked more dead than alive, her massive frame shaking. But what stunned Elliot most wasn't her appearance, it was what she held in her mouth. A small, limp bear cub. Elliot couldn't move. His mind tried to process what he was seeing. The bear didn't growl or advance. She merely stood there, heaving, her amber eyes fixed on him not with animal rage, but with what he could only describe as desperation. The cub dangled from her mouth like a stuffed toy, barely breathing, its tiny limbs trembling with the cold. For a full 30 seconds, man and beast stared at each other, the wilderness swirling around them, as if time had cracked open and allowed 2 stories to bleed together. Elliot backed away slowly, leaving the door ajar. The bear didn't follow. Instead, she laid the cub down on the porch with infinite gentleness, her massive paw nudging it closer to the door before she herself collapsed onto the snow, panting hard. He didn't know what compelled him. Perhaps it was the echoes of his daughter's lullabies in his head, or the unbearable emptiness he'd learned to silence. But he stepped outside into the cold, ignoring the howling wind and the fear gnawing at his gut. He knelt by the cub. Its breathing was faint but present. Carefully, he scooped it into his arms and wrapped it in the wool blanket draped over the porch bench. As he retreated into the house with the tiny bundle, the mother bear raised her head for a brief moment, as if to ensure he had truly taken the cub, then lowered it again, her breath slowing visibly. Inside, Elliot moved with urgency he hadn't felt in years. He cleared a space by the fire, laid the cub on a towel, and began rubbing its body gently to warm it. He wrapped it in additional blankets, checked its limbs, and placed a saucer of warmed goat's milk on the floor nearby. The cub stirred slightly, twitching its nose. Hope stirred with it. But what of the mother? He returned to the doorway and looked out. The bear had not moved from her position. Her body lay half in the snow, half on the porch, her breathing shallow, her eyes barely open. Something was wrong. This wasn't simple exhaustion. It was something deeper, possibly injury or illness. She had given up her cub. Not out of abandonment, but in hope. She had delivered her child to someone, something who might help. It was a cry for help that defied biology, instinct, and logic. Elliot didn't know how to process it, but he knew he couldn't let her die there. Against every primal instinct in his body, he stepped out into the snow again. This time, he carried another blanket, as well as the saucer of warm milk. He crouched a few feet from her and set it down. "You brought her to me," he said softly, "so I'll try to bring you back." He didn't expect her to move, let alone respond, but she did. Slowly, she sniffed at the air, shifted her weight, and inched toward the saucer. Her movements were pained, deliberate, like someone dragging themselves out of a grave. Elliot sat nearby, speaking softly as she lapped at the milk. Her eyes remained wary, but no longer fearful. They shimmered with something close to surrender. When she finished, she didn't move again. She simply lowered herself into the snow and remained there, eyes fluttering shut. That night, Elliot barely slept. He kept a fire going, fed the cub hourly, and watched the window for signs that the mother was still alive. Once, around 3 a.m., he stepped onto the porch and saw her open her eyes at the sound of his steps. He sat beside her, separated by only inches of snow and fear. He wanted to believe she understood, that this strange alliance was more than just a wild coincidence, that she had chosen him. The next morning, as pale winter light crawled across the sky, Elliot found himself in unfamiliar territory. The cub, now breathing more evenly, had nestled into the towel. The mother bear, after attempting and failing to stand, let out a low huff when Elliot stepped near her. It wasn't a warning, but almost a greeting. He offered her more milk and this time, a few pieces of cooked salmon from his meager supply. She ate them slowly, chewing with a painful slowness that made him realize just how long she had been starving. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just a lost animal at his doorstep. This was a survivor. A mother who had fought through the deadliest months of the year, carrying her child across mountains, rivers, and freezing winds, just to place it at the feet of a stranger. She had chosen him, and something about that shattered the final piece of ice in his heart. Later that day, as the snow continued to fall in delicate spirals, Elliot wrapped the cub in a scarf and stepped onto the porch again. The mother bear raised her head. Without thinking, he knelt beside her and held the cub out for her to see. Her paw twitched. Her eyes glistened. She exhaled softly, then dropped her head against the porch with a final, deep sigh. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The morning after bringing the bear and her cubs into his cabin, Elliot awoke to a room still bathed in flickering firelight, a warm contrast to the world outside that remained imprisoned by winter's cruel grip. But as his eyes adjusted and he sat up in his creaking leather chair, he was immediately drawn to the soft shuffling sound coming from the corner where the bears had spent the night. The mother lay curled protectively around her two cubs who nestled tightly against her side, their small chest rising and falling in a much steadier rhythm than the night before, and it struck Elliot how peaceful they looked now, a sharp contrast to the trembling, frostbitten state they had been in just hours earlier, making him feel a quiet surge of pride and protectiveness for creatures he had never imagined letting into his life. Carefully, Elliot rose to his feet, moving slowly so as not to startle them, though the mother bear lifted her head as he approached, her amber eyes alert but calm, and for a moment, they held a gaze that was wordless yet profound. An understanding passed between species, a recognition of help received and help still needed. Without a sound, Elliot retrieved the can of salmon from the night before and fetched another from the cabinet, his movements steady and deliberate, opening the lid and placing the food near the cubs, who, upon catching the scent, began to stir with renewed interest, pawing weakly toward the meal as their mother nudged them gently with her nose to encourage them. Elliot couldn't help but smile, a rare and sincere expression that hadn't touched his face since before the accident that had driven him to this solitary place, and as the cubs ate with slow, tired nibbles, he took a few steps back and poured himself a mug of coffee, leaning against the counter as the smell of warmth and life filled the once lonely space. The cabin had become a sanctuary overnight, not just for the bears but for him too, and he found himself thinking about what came next, not just in terms of food and shelter, but whether this connection could last. Whether the wilderness would claim them again when they were strong enough, or if they would choose to stay nearby. After breakfast, Elliot dressed in thick layers and ventured outside, careful to leave the door cracked open, not wanting the mother bear to think he was abandoning them, and he trudged through the heavy snow to check his generator and refill his woodpile. The chill biting at his cheeks but somehow feeling less oppressive than usual, as if the presence of life inside the cabin had warmed more than just his bones. On his way back, he noticed faint tracks near the edge of the tree line. No predator, just a lone deer that had wandered near, then veered off again, but the sight reminded him that life in the forest continued. Indifferent to his new guests or his sudden need for purpose, and it grounded him in the present. Inside, he cleaned out a corner of the room, setting up a nest of blankets and towels near the fire where the bears could rest more comfortably, and the mother watched him the entire time, her gaze steady and almost thoughtful, as though assessing his motives with each movement of his hands. And when he finished and gestured quietly toward the new space, she slowly shifted her weight and rose, limping over to it and settling down with a heavy sigh, her cubs trailing after her and curling up again in her warm embrace. The transition was seamless, natural, as though they had always belonged there, and Elliot marveled at the trust that had blossomed between them in such a short time, a trust built on nothing more than instinct and compassion. Two things he had thought were lost to him after Claire and Sophie. That afternoon, Elliot took out a journal he hadn't touched in nearly a year, flipping past pages filled with sketches and half-finished thoughts until he found a blank one and began to write, not just about the bears, but about what it felt like to care again. About the warmth that had returned to his life in the shape of a wounded mother and her young, about the strange comfort in waking up to something other than silence. He detailed their injuries, their behaviors, even their breathing rhythms, and included small illustrations of the cubs, one with a darker nose and a cautious gaze, the other more curious, often pawing at the corners of furniture or sniffing Elliot's boots when he got too close, and in doing so, he found himself reclaiming something of the man he used to be, the one who had filled notebooks with wonder instead of grief. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, Elliot foraging for supplies, the bears resting and healing, and the fire crackling constantly like the heartbeat of the home, always warm, always alive, and though the cold outside showed no signs of easing, the warmth inside never wavered, even as snow piled higher and the forest grew quieter under its heavy burden. Each evening, Elliot would read aloud from a book, sometimes poetry, sometimes wildlife guides, even a few fairy tales left over from when Sophie was little, and while he knew the bears couldn't understand the words, the cadence seemed to soothe them, and they would often lift their heads just enough to acknowledge the sound before drifting back to sleep, the cubs pressed tightly to their mother's side. Elliot found himself speaking more, narrating his day, voicing his thoughts aloud, even laughing once when one of the cubs tumbled over trying to chase a dust mote dancing in the sunlight, and the loneliness that had haunted him for years began to recede, replaced by something gentler and far more elusive: hope. One night, he woke to the sound of movement and looked up to find the mother bear standing at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered outside, her posture tense and ears twitching, and Elliot rose quietly, stepping beside her and looking out, but saw only snow and moonlight, no movement, no threat, and after a moment, she returned to her cubs, lying down with a low grunt as though dismissing the alarm, but Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. In the morning, he went outside to scout the perimeter and found new tracks in the snow, human footprints this time, distinct and unmistakable, leading toward the ridge and then veering off, disappearing into the forest. And his stomach dropped with dread as he realized that someone else had come close to the cabin during the night. That evening, he spoke softly to the mother bear, telling her what he had found, watching her reactions carefully, and though she made no sound, her eyes narrowed slightly and she shifted her weight protectively toward the cubs. As if reinforcing the unspoken pact that had formed between them, she trusted him, and in return, he would protect them. Elliot began preparing for the possibility of danger, gathering tools, checking the locks on the cabin, even fashioning makeshift barriers near the porch, and though he knew a confrontation might be inevitable, he felt strangely resolute, anchored by the knowledge that he wasn't just protecting himself anymore. In the stillness of the next morning, he saw one of the cubs playing near the fire, its fur finally clean and shiny, its movements more confident, and he realized just how far they had come in such a short time, from the edge of death to something close to peace. And he whispered to himself that no matter what happened next, this moment had been worth every risk. That night, he sat by the fire long after the bears had fallen asleep, staring at the flames and remembering Claire's voice, Sophie's laugh, the way their lives had once felt full, and for the first time in years, he let the memories in without flinching, letting them coexist with the present rather than push it away. He didn't know how long the bears would stay, whether the stranger in the woods would return, or if the world beyond the snow would ever feel as safe as this cabin had become, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity: this was not just survival anymore. This was healing, and not just for them, but for him too. The sanctuary they had created together, man and beast, was fragile, temporary, and precious, and Elliot vowed silently to honor it for as long as it lasted, to fight for it if necessary, and to remember that even in the deepest winter, even after unbearable loss, there could be warmth again. The forest had started to bloom with new life again, its trees whispering with gentle winds, and the animals reclaiming the quiet paths once ravaged by ice and desperation. Elliot had settled into a rhythm since releasing the mother bear and her 2 cubs into the wild. Each morning, he awoke to the chirping of birds, brewed his coffee, and walked the perimeter of the woods with his camera, no longer to capture the perfect photo, but simply to witness life stirring again. The cabin, once a hollow place echoing with grief, had become a humble sanctuary where the pain of the past softened with time. But peace, as Elliot would soon learn, is never guaranteed, especially when the forest harbors both guardians and enemies. It started with strange noises in the distance, faint, metallic clangs that didn't belong in the symphony of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. At first, Elliot dismissed them, thinking perhaps hikers or campers had wandered deeper into protected land. But then he found the traps. Crude steel snares hidden beneath leaves and snow, set not for survival but slaughter. One lay dangerously close to the clearing where he had once left the mother bear and her cubs. It was then he knew they were back. The poachers. The same ruthless men who scoured these lands in the dead of winter, now emboldened by the thaw and driven by greed. Elliot's heart pounded with a cocktail of fear and fury. This land had become sacred to him. He had bled for it, cried for it, healed with it. The bears weren't just wildlife, they were his family now, his redemption. And he couldn't let it happen again. With trembling hands, he took out his old walkie-talkie, long unused, and sent a crackling signal to Maeve. She was the only one he trusted, the only person who had believed his story when no one else would. Her voice came through minutes later, calm but edged with concern. "I'm on my way," she said, without needing to ask more. Within hours, Maeve arrived at the cabin with her field gear, maps, binoculars, motion sensor cameras, and a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they devised a plan. The traps weren't just carelessly placed, they were coordinated, suggesting a group effort. The poachers were working methodically, encroaching deeper each day. Worse, they were setting up night camps, evidenced by burnt logs and beer cans near hidden coves of the stream. It wasn't just about hunting anymore, it was an organized exploitation operation. Elliot and Maeve spent the next few days monitoring movements. They set up trail cameras, noting where paths overlapped with known animal crossings. What they found chilled them to the bone. Images of men carrying rifles with silencers, dragging carcasses of deer and foxes, and even attempting to track larger predators. One frame showed a man holding up a cub's paw. It was bloodied. Elliot nearly smashed the camera screen with his fist. "We don't have time," he said through clenched teeth. "They've already started." Maeve suggested reaching out to the local wildlife department again. Elliot hesitated, remembering how dismissive they had been before, chalking his warnings up to wilderness paranoia. But this time, they had proof. Together, they compiled a report, timestamps, GPS coordinates, photographs, and a map of known poacher activity. They submitted it all and waited. Days passed. No answer. That's when Elliot realized the truth: bureaucracy moved slower than bullets. And the bears didn't have that kind of time. One evening, as Elliot returned from checking a camera trap, he saw movement near the cabin, slow, deliberate. His breath caught. It was her, the mother bear. But she wasn't alone. Her cubs followed closely, now older but visibly anxious. The bear's fur was ruffled, her gait uneven. Something was wrong. She looked at Elliot, not with the calm recognition from before, but with an urgency that demanded action. He followed her without a word. She led him not to the stream or the cave, but to a hidden clearing littered with broken branches and claw marks. Blood stained the snow. One of the cubs sniffed the area and let out a soft whimper. Another bear had been attacked, possibly killed. Elliot fell to his knees, rage boiling in his chest. He knew then this was no longer a question of observation. He had to intervene. With Maeve's help, he began tracking the poachers directly. They followed foot trails, broken twigs, cigarette butts, and bits of shredded fur until they found the new poacher's base, a crude wooden shelter tucked between two rocky ridges. From their vantage point, they saw three men huddled around a fire, rifles propped against tree trunks, and crates filled with animal parts and pelts. The sight made Elliot's stomach churn. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, the cubs nestled beside their mother just beyond the cabin walls, their presence a silent reminder of the urgency at hand. Maeve paced the room, going over options. "We have to smoke them out," she finally said. "Give them a reason to run, then alert the authorities once we've got video of them in action." Elliot nodded. "But if anything goes wrong, we could die out there." Maeve gave a grim smile. "Then we make sure it doesn't." The next morning, Elliot and Maeve moved quickly. They set off a controlled noise device, a timed flare that mimicked the sound of a bear's growl amplified through a speaker system. The poachers took the bait. Startled and armed, they left their shelter to investigate. Meanwhile, Maeve entered their camp, recording everything with a body cam, illegal traps, unlicensed firearms, crates with endangered animal remains. She grabbed what she could and radioed Elliot. "Go," she said. But they weren't fast enough. One poacher circled back, spotting Maeve just as she slipped behind the tree line. A shot rang out, grazing her shoulder. She stumbled, blood blooming through her jacket. Elliot, hearing the chaos, ran toward the sound. That's when he saw the mother bear. She stood between Maeve and the armed man, her body low and teeth bared. The poacher aimed, but before he could shoot, Elliot tackled him from the side. The gun fired into the air as the two men crashed into the snow. The bear didn't attack. She just stood, watching, ensuring that Maeve was safe. Elliot held the man down until Maeve, with shaking hands, called the authorities. This time, they came, thanks to the footage she sent moments before. Within hours, rangers arrived by snowmobile, rounding up the poachers and confiscating their gear. It was over. For now. That night, Elliot sat outside the cabin, his jacket soaked with melted snow and sweat. The mother bear approached him, slow and silent. Her gaze met his, and this time it wasn't urgency or fear, it was relief. She turned back toward the forest, her cubs following close. As they disappeared into the trees, Elliot whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know if she understood. But maybe, just maybe, she did. The forest, though quieter in the days following the poacher's arrest, pulsed with a tension that Elliot couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting, not with fear, but with a primal awareness that something had been disturbed. And deep in his bones, Elliot could feel it too. The victory over the poachers hadn't restored balance. Not yet. Because nature, in all its beauty and wildness, never forgets when it's been wounded. Elliot stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the trees sway under a dull gray sky. The clouds above churned with a restless energy, and the air felt strangely charged, as though the forest had absorbed every act of violence and was now bracing to exhale. He glanced toward the cabin where Maeve rested and sighed, her shoulder bandaged, her spirit bruised but unbroken. Despite the pain, she had insisted on staying. "We're not done yet," she had whispered, her eyes locked on the tree line. And she was right. That evening, as Elliot sat journaling by the fire, a low rumble shook the ground beneath his feet. At first, he thought it was a distant storm rolling in over the mountains, but when he stepped outside, there were no flashes of lightning, no rain-scented breeze. Just the heavy silence of a forest watching itself burn. The wind changed suddenly, sharp and dry, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke. Elliot turned north, his eyes scanning the horizon. A faint glow pulsed behind the hills. Then another, and another. A wildfire. Fast, aggressive, unnatural. Panic gripped him like a vice. He rushed inside, rousing Maeve, who winced as she sat up. "It's happening, isn't it?" she asked, already sensing the truth. Elliot nodded grimly. "We have to move. Now." The cabin, though sturdy, was not equipped to withstand a full-scale blaze, especially not one spreading with this kind of velocity. He packed quickly first aid supplies, dry food, his journal, and the carved stone he kept near the hearth. It had become more than just a relic to him. A symbol, a talisman, something sacred. As they prepared to evacuate, Elliot heard it again, a sound that didn't belong to wind or fire. A growl, low and deep, cutting through the smoke-choked air like a warning bell. He looked toward the trees. The mother bear stood there, her eyes glinting with reflected firelight. The cubs were nowhere in sight. She growled again, then turned and ran. Not away from the fire, but into it. "What is she doing?" Maeve gasped, trying to stand. Elliot hesitated only a second before racing after her. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to find safety, but something deeper compelled him forward. The bear wouldn't have come unless there was something more. As he followed her into the blazing forest, the heat slammed into him like a wall. Branches above crackled with flames, sending glowing embers cascading down like fireflies. The mother bear darted between burning trunks, her massive form agile despite the chaos. Elliot tripped twice, singed his sleeve, and lost his breath to the smoke, but he kept going. At last, she led him to a narrow ravine where the fire hadn't yet reached. In the center, hidden behind a fallen log, were the two cubs. Trembling, trapped, Elliot's heart seized. He scrambled down the slope and scooped them up, one in each arm. Their fur was hot, and their eyes wide with fear. He turned to the bear. "Let's go." But she didn't move. Instead, she stared at him, then at the ground near the log. Confused, Elliot shifted one of the cubs under his arm and looked where she indicated. There, half buried in ash and stone, was something glowing faintly on another carved stone. Smaller than the one he had found in the cave months ago, but etched with the same ancient symbols: a bear, a man, fire, and a tree. Without thinking, Elliot reached for it. The moment his fingers closed around it, the ground trembled. A sudden gust of wind surged through the ravine, parting the smoke and sending sparks upward instead of down. The fire, alive, almost intelligent, seemed to hesitate, giving them just enough time to escape. Elliot didn't question it. He ran. The bear followed close behind, the three of them charging through the narrow gap in the trees that opened into a rocky clearing. Just as they emerged, the path behind them collapsed in a shower of sparks and falling branches. Maeve, who had managed to follow more slowly, let out a gasp as she saw them reappear, cubs in tow, the mother bear lumbering behind them. "You're insane," she wheezed, clutching her side, but then she saw the second stone in his hand. "That's another one?" Elliot nodded, speechless. The stone glowed brighter now, pulsing with warmth as though responding to the danger, or the unity, or both. They retreated together, man, woman, bear, and cubs, to the edge of a high cliff overlooking the forest. The fire below raged, consuming tree after tree, but something strange happened as they watched. The flame shifted direction, bending away from the cliff space as though redirected by some invisible force. Birds soared overhead, fleeing the inferno. Deer ran past in panicked herds. And all around them, the forest roared, not with terror, but with resistance. Elliot clutched the two stones in his hands, feeling their heat surge into his palms. He remembered the cave drawings, the prophecy Maeve had spoken of, the bond between man and protector bear. Could it be real? Could they, together, be part of something ancient? The questions spun through his mind like embers in the wind, but he had no time to answer them. He had to act. "We have to help the others," he told Maeve, who nodded through her pain. Together, they returned to the cabin long enough to grab what supplies remained. Then, using flares and Elliot's camera gear, they began signaling to nearby rangers and volunteers who might still be in the area. Smoke filled the air. The sky turned a sickly orange. But one by one, shapes emerged from the haze: people, animals, a community galvanized by urgency. The mother bear didn't leave their side. She seemed to understand the danger and the need for coordination. She roared at deer who froze in fear. She nudged foxes from their burrows. She even stood at the entrance of the cave where the first stone had been found, guiding Elliot to place both relics side by side within its mouth. The ground pulsed beneath their feet. A windstorm rose suddenly, natural or not. Elliot would never know, but it pushed the fire back just enough to save the sacred ground. That night, the fire line held. Rangers arrived, assisted by local volunteers who'd followed Elliot's signal flares. The blaze didn't vanish, but it was contained. The forest had burned, but not broken. And within its surviving heart, a new legend had been born. Elliot sat by the cave with Maeve and the bears beside him. He held both stones in his hands, now cool and still. The forest was silent, not in mourning, but in rest, as though it, too, had fought and survived. "You think they'll believe us this time?" Maeve asked quietly, staring at the stars above. "They won't have to," Elliot replied. "They'll feel it." The forest did not sleep. Not truly. Even after the fire had been driven back and the threat of devastation temporarily stalled, a hum lingered in the trees, a resonance of memory and pain. It buzzed in the pine needles, shimmered in the cold streams, and settled beneath the soil scorched by flame. Elliot felt it with every step he took. The land had survived, but it had not forgotten. And neither had he. In the days that followed the fire, Elliot and Maeve made their way back to the cabin. It stood battered but intact, the exterior charred along the western wall where embers had licked at the wooden siding. The windows were sooty, and the porch was scattered with ash, but the cabin had held. It was a small miracle in the middle of a wounded world. They cleared what they could, patching up gaps and placing buckets to catch the slow leaks from the roof. Their movements were quiet, deliberate, reverent. The bears remained close. The mother bear and her cubs lingered near the perimeter of the clearing, never fully approaching, yet never straying too far. It was a dance of distance and devotion. The cubs had grown slightly in just those few days, fueled by the canned salmon and jerky Elliot left for them in quiet offerings. The mother bear would watch from a rise just beyond the tree line, her gaze soft but steady. Elliot began to think of her not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as something else entirely, a guardian. One morning, Elliot woke to find a circle of paw prints pressed into the frost outside his cabin door. Perfect, deliberate, as if the bear had paced there under the stars, contemplating whether to knock. He knelt beside the prints, brushing the frost gently, and something inside him shifted. Not fear. Not wonder. Something like recognition. As if the woods were calling him into a conversation too old for words. He and Maeve began exploring again, searching for answers. Not about the fire. That threat had passed. But about the stones. The carvings. The way the flames had been around them, obeying some primal force neither of them could name. They visited the cave again. This time with tools and lights. The second stone Elliot had discovered near the ravine now sat alongside the first, both resting in a small bowl-shaped depression at the back of the cave. Beneath them, etched into the stone floor, was a new image. A man and a bear standing side by side. Maeve knelt beside the etching, brushing away loose soil. "These are old," she murmured. "Older than the settlers. Maybe older than the tribes. This might predate known language." "Then how do you explain the man?" Elliot asked, crouching beside her. "The symbols, they're specific. That one's fire. That one's healing." She stared at the carving, her brow furrowed. "Maybe it's a promise," she said softly. "A pact. Between the first who lived here and the forest first protectors." The idea settled into Elliot like a seed into fertile soil. He couldn't shake it. Not that night, nor the next. Even when Maeve returned to town for further medical treatment, reluctantly, with promises to return, he remained behind, tending the land and the cabin, always watching the tree line. And the bears stayed too. They were no longer visitors. They were a presence. A reminder. Then came the letter. Folded neatly and wedged between the splinters of the cabin's doorframe was a parchment. No envelope. No address. Just 3 words etched in clean, precise ink. "Leave. Or burn." Elliot read it once. Then again. His blood turned cold, not from fear, but fury. He thought of the poachers. The fire. The near death of the cubs. Someone had survived. Someone who had vowed revenge. Or worse, someone else had taken notice of what the fire hadn't finished. And they were coming. He didn't report it. He didn't tell Maeve. Not yet. Instead, he prepared. He reinforced the cabin, securing doors and windows with salvaged metal sheets and nails. He cleaned his old trail cameras and set them up around the clearing, facing the paths from every direction. He mounted a motion sensor light on the porch. At night, he sat by the window with his journal open but his eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond. And still, the bears remained. On the 3rd night after the letter arrived, he heard something branches snapping. Not the light-footed scurry of deer. Not the weightless flutter of birds. This was heavy. Intentional. Human. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding, every instinct screaming. The porch light flickered on, revealing the snow-covered clearing and nothing else. Until the flashlight beam swept left. There, just at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. Masked, hooded, holding something in his hands. A canister. Before Elliot could shout, the man flung it. The canister struck the cabin wall, rolling to a stop. Smoke burst from the seams, thick, oily, choking. Elliot ran to kick it away just as the figure vanished into the trees. He coughed, eyes burning, the scent of fuel unmistakable. Not just a threat this time. An attempt. That's when the roar came. From the forest's mouth came the mother bear. She burst from the trees like a storm given form. Elliot barely had time to turn before he saw her hurtling through the smoke, past him, toward the fleeing figure. A scream rang out. Not hers. The man's. A guttural, terrified cry. Elliot stumbled to the edge of the tree line in time to see the man scrambling backward, his arm bleeding where the bear had swiped. He vanished into the woods, dropping whatever ignition device he'd carried. The forest swallowed him. The bear didn't chase. She returned to the edge of the clearing, blood on her claws, her breath fogging in the night air. And she looked at Elliot, not with pride, not with menace, but with something older. A shared rage. A mutual defense. This place was not his alone. It was theirs. And it would be protected. Elliot collapsed onto the steps of the cabin. The smoke cleared slowly. The fire hadn't caught. He had been spared it again. Not by chance. By choice. The mother bear had made hers. He spent the next morning gathering the stones from the cave. Not to hide them. Not to bury them. But to display them. He built a shrine at the edge of the clearing. A circle of river stones around a wooden pedestal, carved with the symbol of the bear and man. Upon it, he placed the twin stones. And at the base, he laid an offering, a page from his journal. On it, in trembling script, he had written, "This is your home too, and I am no longer alone." That evening, the bears returned. Not just the mother and cubs, but others. Young males, older females, bears Elliot had only glimpsed in the distance. They didn't approach the cabin. They approached the shrine. One by one, they entered the circle. They sniffed the stones. They circled the base. They lingered. Elliot watched from the porch, camera in hand. But he didn't take a photo. He just wept. For the first time in years, not from sorrow, but from awe. He knew then what he had become. Not just a witness. Not even just a protector. He was a part of the pact. A steward of the wild. A voice among the trees. And the bears, once symbols of his isolation, had become his family. The snow began to melt. Not in a grand flourish, but slowly, subtly, drip by drip, thaw by thaw. Icicles, once stalactites of winter's fury, now dribbled steadily down the eaves of Elliot's cabin. The stream beside the clearing, once frozen over in solid silence, now trickled faintly, like the land was exhaling for the first time in months. Patches of earth emerged from beneath the retreating snow, brown, damp, and full of promise. The wilderness, long muted by frost and silence, stirred with life again. Inside the cabin, Elliot moved slower these days, not out of fatigue, but reverence. Every movement felt ceremonial now. Every routine, a quiet act of gratitude. He would rise before dawn, make his single mug of coffee, and sit on the porch as the horizon peeled open in pastel hues. He no longer brought the camera with him. He didn't need to. The memories lived behind his eyes now, scenes etched into his mind far more vividly than any lens could replicate. The shrine remained untouched. The river stones stayed in perfect formation. The two carved stones still stood atop the wooden pedestal. And every few days, fresh tracks would appear around the site, massive paw prints encircling the shrine like sacred sentinels. Sometimes, he would catch a glimpse of the mother bear in the tree lane, standing guard as her cubs explored the area around the shrine, now growing taller, stronger, more curious with each passing day. It was a new chapter, but the book wasn't closed. Maeve returned as promised, her arm still in a brace, but her energy restored. She brought with her new supplies, local rumors, and the results of the symbols they had sent off for analysis. They sat at the kitchen table as she spread out the findings. The carvings were ancient, predating the known indigenous tribes of the region, possibly even part of a long-lost oral tradition preserved only in myth. A pact between humans and animals. A sacred guardianship of the land. "You were right," she whispered, fingers tracing one of the sketches. "They came to you because they remembered. Because somewhere, in the bones of this forest, that pact still lives." Elliot didn't reply immediately. He watched the smoke curling from the wood stove and thought of the fire, the bear's roar, the way the cubs had nestled against his chest. "No," he said softly. "They didn't come to me because I was worthy. They came to me because I needed them. And they gave me a second chance." The letter, the threat, the attack, it had all passed. There were no more intrusions. The man had disappeared into the forest and hadn't returned. Maybe the bear had scared him enough. Maybe the forest had swallowed him whole. Or maybe the shrine had cast its own protection over the clearing. Whatever the reason, Elliot no longer lived in fear. The camera traps remained up, but more out of habit than paranoia. And the shrine, its presence seemed to radiate peace now, not urgency. With spring came new challenges and opportunities. Elliot began expanding the cabin, not to add luxury, but to make room. He built a new shelter farther out, using salvage wood and supplies Maeve helped haul in from town. It wasn't for people. It was for the animals. A healing space. A neutral ground. Word had begun to spread about the man who lived with bears. Rangers stopped by. Scientists. A documentary crew even reached out. But Elliot refused most of them. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in preservation. Maeve stayed longer this time. Her bond with Elliot had deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. Not romance, exactly, but kinship. Shared survival. Shared reverence. Together, they began cataloging the wildlife around the clearing, mapping migration patterns, setting up observation perches farther out in the forest. The land, it seemed, was recovering, and it was sharing its stories again, one footprint at a time. One morning, as Elliot walked the path along the ridge where the bear had first led him to the cave, he spotted something unusual. A new carving. Not old. Not ancient. Fresh. Etched into the bark of a tree with deliberate care. A paw print. Beside it, a handprint. And beneath both, a spiral, an unbroken circle. Elliot stared at it, unsure whether it had been carved by human or something else. The spiral was a symbol often found in ancient petroglyphs, representing cycles, eternity, connection. He reached out, touching the cold bark, his fingers tracing the grooves. It didn't matter who had carved it. What mattered was that it had appeared, that the bond had been acknowledged again. The bears visited less frequently as the seasons changed. They had places to roam, dens to claim, cubs to teach. But they always returned. Not out of dependence, but out of memory. Out of recognition. The mother bear would arrive at the edge of the clearing, sit beside the shrine, and wait. Elliot would come out with a small offering: salmon, honey, berries. Sometimes he'd just sit beside her in silence. The cubs, now young bears themselves, would circle the clearing, sniffing the air, testing their strength. They were wild. They were home. And so was he. The final snowmelt came in April. The last icicles dropped from the eaves, and the forest exploded into bloom. Wildflowers erupted from the earth, brilliant in color. Birds returned, their songs weaving through the trees like hymns. The stream beside the shrine flowed freely, its waters glinting in the sun. And one night, under a sky full of stars, Elliot sat with Maeve and opened a new journal. He titled the first page simply, Legacy. The entries weren't about him. They were about the forest, the bears, the pact. He wrote about the carvings, the shrine, the night of the fire. He wrote about the cub snuggling against his coat, and the way the mother bear had looked at him, not like a beast, but like an equal. He wrote of grief, of healing, of how the wilderness had taken him apart and then gently stitched him back together. One evening, he and Maeve ventured deeper into the forest than they had ever gone. Guided by instinct, and perhaps something older, they stumbled upon another cave. Smaller, hidden behind a curtain of moss. Inside were more carvings. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. A timeline written not in ink but in stone. Bears. Wolves. Elk. Humans. Spirals. Hands. Paws. A history of balance etched across generations. They left an offering there, too. A stone from the shrine. A page from Elliot's journal. A drawing of the mother bear and her cubs, done in soft charcoal. Maeve placed it gently on the floor of the cave, weighted by a smooth river rock. We're not the first, she whispered. And we won't be the last, Elliot replied. As spring gave way to summer, the cabin became a sanctuary, not just for Elliot, but for others who needed it. Wounded animals were brought in. A fox with a broken leg. An owl with a clipped wing. People came too quietly, respectfully. A veteran suffering from PTSD. A young girl who hadn't spoken in months. They stayed. They healed. Then they left, taking pieces of the forest with them in their hearts. And always, the bears watched. On the anniversary of that first winter night, when the mother bear had come to his door, desperate and shivering, Elliot lit a lantern and walked to the shrine. He placed a jar of honey at the base, along with a single photograph. It was the only one he had taken since that night. The bears, asleep by the fire. He lit the lantern, letting its glow bathe the shrine in gold. And for a moment, he stood in silence. Then he spoke, not loudly, not ceremonially, but like one speaking to an old friend. Thank you. The wind stirred the trees. A soft rustle echoed through the clearing. And then, just beyond the trees, a shadow moved. A bear. Watching. Elliot smiled. The story had never been about a man saving a bear. It had always been about a bear saving a man. About a bond older than memory. A promise carved not in stone, but in action, in trust. And as the light faded from the lantern and the stars rose above the forest, Elliot knew the truth. The pact still held. The forest would endure. And he was no longer alone.